Welcome to the Wellford podcast. I'm your host, Josh Roberts. I'm the Chief Business Officer and a co-founder at Wellford. In this series, we explore the evolving world of medical cannabis through real patient stories, expert perspectives, and insights from healthcare professionals and growers. The views shared by our guests are their own and may not reflect those of Wellford.
Okay, we're live on the Wellford podcast. Welcoming Chris Tasker. Wondering if you could just give a quick intro to yourself and your company, Global Cannabinoid Solutions.
Yeah, no, gladly, and thanks for having us, Josh. So, started off as a medical researcher and was doing medical research into cannabinoids at university, specifically looking at how the endocannabinoid system is altered in different diseases, cancer, gut disorders, and how we can use phytocannabinoids and cannabis, synthetic cannabinoids and endocannabinoids to then treat those diseases. And we saw very quickly on and very early on in the emergence of the cannabis industry around 2018, 2019, that there was a distinct shortage of business knowledge around cannabinoids, particularly the science and what was true and what was false. And then also just a massive wave of products flowing into the UK industry. And so what we decided to do was kind of address that scarcity of cannabinoid knowledge and make it as accessible and applicable and practical as possible. And so what we've done is essentially develop into a digital cannabinoid science lab. And so we help companies translate those thousands of studies into useful insights for their doctors, for their business strategy, and into useful information that helps patients get a bit more clarity as well on how it helps their health, how they can use it for their medical conditions, and then also obviously mitigate many of the concerns and risks and potential adverse effects that come along with cannabis, basically. So we're now a living R&D lab and here to help the cannabis industry, businesses, entrepreneurs, and just make science as accessible, as exciting, and applicable as possible. Because it does tend to get quite boring. It gets locked in these research papers, and I'm sure you've had a good time, Josh, of trying to pick apart what's going on with the science, what's true, what's false, all the different diseases. And so, we're now got a platform and an open access lab where people can come and see the truth medically, what we know in terms of patient safety, patient information, good practices, and how that all applies to this new cannabis industry that we found ourselves in. And so excited for the conversation, Josh. And I think it's cool. We've come from kind of different angles, but having the same conversation and see a lot of the same issues and problems and potential as well. So I think we'll get into some good topics, and I've come prepared with some facts for you as well. So I'll hopefully have some interesting talking points.
Good. Great. Yeah. I mean, maybe we could just jump into a bit of commentary on the UK cannabis market. And just what do you think of, what's been going on recently and just the state of play now?
I'd say it's a bit of a continuation of the same problem I mentioned at the start, which is kind of access to cannabis products, access to cannabis industry information and medical interventions has sort of outstripped our knowledge at this point. And I think with what we do know about cannabinoids and the endocannabinoid system, there's a great baseline for us to sort of feed on and use to start making decisions right now and moving health towards moving our healthcare industry towards integrating cannabinoids in a nice, efficacious way that lines up with that baseline of science that we've already got. But I think there is a tendency, and this happens in most medical sectors, for that baseline science to sometimes be a bit of hyperbole around it, a bit of over generalization. And I think that's sort of where we're up to with the cannabis industry at the moment. There's a lot of promise, a lot of hope, a lot of potential, but then in practice, there's a lot of gaps and practical nuances that need to start to be integrated into how businesses conduct their trade, their strategy, the products they develop, the medical services that they provide. And I think there needs to be a bit more of a realignment at the moment between, again, the facts and sort of where the industry's up to. And it does seem we're kind of getting ahead of where the actual science is up to and what we do know and don't know. Obviously, companies want to move fast, want to evolve, want to get good products in patients' hands, but we are at a kind of like maybe a turning point, maybe like a fork in the road, where the industry is maybe becoming a little too maybe confident, or maybe a little too insular as well, and it's becoming a bit of an echo chamber. So a lot of the critical thinking, a lot of the nuances and challenges of cannabinoid science and research and medicine haven't quite been integrated into the business model yet. Obviously, there's a massive amount of science that's there. There's a massive amount of companies and personnel within those companies, and then even more patients receiving these medicines. So there's quite a lot of education that needs to take place over the next couple of years, standardization of information as well. If I say CBD to someone, that could mean 1,000 different things to the person that I'm speaking to. And those kind of linguistic translations, I think, lead to a lot of issues within the cannabis industry, but then also, as we see as well, in terms of interpretation of the cannabis industry by the media and journalists. And so, incredible potential, and I think it's just now a matter of making that science more accessible. And again, that's kind of why we do what we do. And I guess I'm answering my own questions, Josh, in a way. But
Yeah.
It's just real. I think a bit of realignment needs to take place, and obviously we've got a bit of bleed over from the massive recreational market that there is in North America, and obviously the influence of that financially, industrially, in terms of supply chains as well. So there's a lot of different dynamics that I guess are being like brushing up against each other, and obviously politicians have questions about that. Obviously journalists and newspapers and media have questions about that too, and so do the public. So I think it's very much a ongoing conversation, and eventually people will start to distill down to what's true and what's false. But unfortunately, given that there's been a bit of an embargo on cannabinoids, cannabis, medicine, research and development in the field, that a lot of those conversations are being kind of maybe pushed to the periphery, haven't quite made it into the centerfold of the conversation. And so I think that's what we'll be doing today anyway, Josh, is breaking down maybe some of the science, how it applies to where the industry is at the moment, maybe some of the challenges the industry faces, and how we can maybe help demystify some of that and interpret perhaps some of the current events that are going on at the moment, and as well just the classic concerns that people have around cannabis too. So lots of mythbusting
I mean,
needs to be done.
what are the biggest misconceptions that you think still persist in Europe and the UK? You know, say like the top 3 that would be really good to get out to the public to say, actually, what you think is this is really this.
So I'd say probably on 2 sides. In terms of the cannabis plant, I think a lot of people, and again, just saying cannabis, that creates a lot of creates a mental model for people as to what I'm talking about. And cannabis is an incredibly nuanced, dynamic plant that has a plethora of different applications, but then also 1,000+ different compounds within it. And so when we talk about cannabis, there's 150 roughly different phytocannabinoids we can talk about. There's untold numbers of terpenes, flavonoids, and other chemicals in cannabis. And I think the primary misconception is a lot of people look at cannabis as this binary, linear substance that's either good or bad, and it doesn't quite get broken down into the different elements, compounds, and then the numerous varieties of cannabis and the numerous variety of chemical compounds that can be in cannabis as well, depending on where it's being produced, its genetic profile. So I'd say, firstly, we do tend to look at cannabis in quite a binary sense, a linear kind of perspective. And then I think generally on the human side, people underestimate how unique every individual's response is to those very dynamic cannabis compounds and cannabis substances that are being consumed by humans. So in the same way we've got quite unique fingerprints between all humans on your finger, I'd say we've got very unique response fingerprints and profiles to those very unique cannabis compounds and cannabis plants and products. So there's, I guess, two layers of variability, and then within that, misconceptions being that you have to kind of smoke it. Everyone that uses cannabinoid medicines must be growing some kind of cannabis plant or doing something nefarious. And so I'd say there's probably the stigma side of the misconceptions, and then misconceptions about the human body, how it responds to cannabis. We produce our own naturally occurring cannabinoids in the human body. Most people don't understand that first and foremost. That's kind of like the fundamental. And then when it comes to cannabis, you've got 1,500 different compounds that could potentially do any number of things when then introduced into the human body. So I'd say that's probably the three pillars of the misconceptions around cannabis. And then obviously within those three pillars, there's a lot of nuanced conversation to have as you sort of break those misconceptions down. Do you find
Cool.
you encounter any of those particularly, Josh?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just strife. I mean, everything in this industry is not everything is misconception, but so much is based on old, antiquated ideas of what cannabis is and how it works. And really, no one understands, not many people understand how it really works in the body. They know, it has an effect, but the endocannabinoid system is this amazing system that's so integral to so many parts of our bodily functions. I mean, why don't you go into just a bit of the ECS, just kind of explain it if you would, and then, how it works with cannabis.
So I think, simply put, every human is a kind of an organization of billions of cells, and all of these cells are communicating constantly in order to organize the smooth function of us as a human. You've got your heart cells, you've got your lung cells, you've got your skin cells. All of these are coordinated, and there's a couple of signaling systems that the body uses to manage our organs, our heart rate, our hunger, and the endocannabinoid system kind of sits between all of those cellular communications. And when we introduce cannabis into the body, we alter the communications between all of those billions of cells. And unfortunately, and I say unfortunately, and maybe it's a benefit too, but because of how vast the chemical constituents are of cannabis, when you put that into the human body, we really don't know how it affects all of those billions of communications. And so the role of the endocannabinoid system is managing all of those and making sure that those billions of cells don't become uncoordinated, that they don't become aggressive with each other and maybe cause autoimmune inflammation, or they don't become non-functional and cause disease. And the endocannabinoid system is the little chemical signals that those cells use to communicate, coordinate, maintain homeostasis within the body. So the whole goal of the human body is to just maintain itself in terms of like temperature, so you don't overheat, so you've got enough oxygen to fuel all of those cells. And so those cells are putting huge demands on the body, and the endocannabinoid system helps balance all of those communications and cells. And what we see oftentimes in disease is that that cellular balancing is kind of slightly nudged out of function, or it's slightly altered, or potentially upregulated in different disease states and different conditions. And the requirements of your body and the requirements of that communication vary person to person throughout your lifespan, when you're exercising, when you're sleeping. And so there's all of these different regulations, all of these different kind of waves to managing a billion cells and keeping them all coordinated and sort of harmonious. And so I think most people probably stopped doing science at around 14, 16 at school, and maybe had a really bad science teacher or a really boring kind of chemistry teacher or something. And that's maybe switched them off to how interesting the body is. But fundamentally, we're made up of billions of different cells all communicating, and the endocannabinoid system is that crucial, or one of the crucial elements that helps us coordinate all of those cells, all of their unique functions, and it's kind of like a bit of a master CEO or maybe HR of the human body, basically, to keep everyone happy and make sure they've got enough rest, make sure they've got enough oxygen,
Yeah.
holidays, things like that as well, Josh. So I don't know if I've
Yeah.
given good enough
No, that's a
condensed
good
version.
rounded view of the ECS. I mean, we have many patients that say that their quality of life is really changed for the positive using cannabis. And I wonder, with the ECS and in terms of the homeostasis that cannabis supposedly brings to the endocannabinoid system and the whole body, is it that homeostasis is helping to ameliorate disease, or is it the actual reduction of inflammation that cannabis is potentially doing? Like, how is cannabis helping the body? I know it's going through the ECS, but could you just speak a bit about how that affects disease?
Mm. So fundamentally, a lot of disease comes down to non-functional cells. So it may be that there's a region of your gut that's damaged and those cells are not cooperating and not aligning with the rest of the body. And then that could manifest as a kind of gut disorder, Crohn's disease, chronically inflamed gut as an example. And what's usually present in those cells that are non-cooperative and diseased or inflamed or damaged is alterations in the endocannabinoid system for whatever reason. So it may be that it's a little overactive and maybe it's causing irritation. Maybe it's underactive, and so certain elements of your gut aren't fulfilling their requirements. So with the gut, you've obviously got like a tube of cells in a big sausage, and food passes through that sausage. Nutrients are absorbed through the gut. Sometimes, if there's a faulty gut, then it starts absorbing toxic elements too. And what we see is that the cells that line your stomach have different unique fingerprints and profiles. And I'm talking about specifically the unhealthy cells have an altered profile to the rest of the healthy body. And so what we can start to do is then, okay, what elements are maybe heightened or reduced or faulty or deficient compared to the healthy tissue. And so if we look at, say, cancer, for example, cancer is a great example of kind of homeostasis breaking down, primarily due to DNA mutations, which is where all of these cells get their like instructions from, essentially. Those mutations cause the cells to produce different endocannabinoid system profiles, different toxicity profiles, different functional profiles. And you can visually see the difference between cancerous cells and healthy cells, but you can also measure the endocannabinoid difference between cancerous cells and healthy cells. So you can take samples from that cancer or from around the cancer and measure what's in that fluid, what's in that sample, and then look at whichever elements of the endocannabinoid system or whichever elements of the DNA that you want to analyze and see that, oh, the CB1 receptor is not functional here, or it's not present, or it's massively reduced on this healthy side, or anandamide has been increased massively and 2AG's dropped. And so you can start to see where in the fingerprint of the disease or in the healthy cell or in the cancer cell, where the potential alterations might be, and those become therapeutic targets essentially for medical researchers to start looking at. But the caveat is that every disease has very different endocannabinoid system alteration profiles, very different deficiencies. And then between humans, yourself and I, we might have the same neurological condition or the same type of cancer. But when you analyze those cancers, they're completely different. And so unique to the individual, unique to the disease. And then when it comes to actually making a treatment that targets that uniqueness, that's kind of where cannabis medicines fall down in their current form. And if we are targeting specific diseases with cannabis, it becomes quite difficult to know which of those 1,500 compounds is interacting with the disease and where in the body are those compounds interacting with the disease as well. And so it leads us down then a bit more of a conversation around precision medicine, personalization of medicines, and as well, what else can we do in addition to drug interventions to improve and optimize that person's health, the environment of the body, the rest of the billions of cells that are in there, and use that for overall progress making in terms of managing disease, curing disease. Obviously, if we're talking about cancers, a lot of them you can just surgically remove. It's not the be all and end all. There might still be cancerous tissue, but that's the main kind of intervention at the moment for a lot of cancers. Chemotherapies are obviously quite taxing on the body, and I'm using cancer as an example because it's a very vivid one that a lot of people are maybe aware of. And this is where we've got a lot of unpicking to do still in terms of research as to profiling then all of those different diseases. What happens if we've got 1,000 patients with the same colorectal cancer, say it's stage 2 colorectal cancer? How variable and what's in all of those people's different colorectal cancers, and how is there anything that's common? Is there anything that's different? Are there any standouts? And how can we potentially use that information as a target for medical treatments and potential therapies that start undoing maybe some of that disease progression, maybe some of that damage in the body and the cancer and the tissues around the cancers. So it's quite going back to our initial conversation about the variations in cannabis and the variations in each person's endocannabinoid system. You've then got very unique variances in people's diseases. And so maybe our current medical system doesn't do a great job of intertwining some of that personalization into medical healthcare. And there's a lot of other factors as well that can influence disease and health and disease progression that maybe don't involve drug interventions as well. And so going back to those communications, if we can encourage homeostasis within the human body, I mean, if you can cut out smoking, that might be one of the triggers that's upsetting the cells within your body. It might be you don't drink water, you only drink energy drinks, or you only eat sugar, you don't eat any vegetables. All these different, what seem like kind of irrelevant factors have a massive influence on your overall human organism and the ecosystem, and then the cellular demands of all of those different regions of your body as well. So there's a lot we don't know, there's a lot we do know. And then when that comes to actually then translating that into clinical practice, there's maybe some good guidelines, some good parameters that we can put out there, but then there is a lot of drilling down that needs to be done in terms of what are we targeting, how are we targeting it, and how can we reliably get the compounds we want to the place that we want them. So big challenge with cannabis is you might be treating arthritis of the knees, but the whole organism, the whole patient is going to be experiencing the effects of those cannabinoids. So it's very hard to precisely impact one part of the body. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge that maybe the cannabis industry at the moment faces, is the variety of reactions to one strain of cannabis. But obviously that one strain of cannabis can have a number of different chemicals in it and a completely different fingerprint, even though it's from the same genetic batch. One area might have got more light, one area might have got a little bit more nutrition. So it's incredibly hard to standardize the plant matter to start with. And so I guess we're now going through the process of trying to match the variable diseases to the variable compounds to then create great medicines that work for patients with fibromyalgia, epilepsy, gut disorders, and sort of inflammatory conditions as well. So there's quite a lot to unpack, and we can jump in, I guess, to any of those areas
Yeah.
as well, Josh?
Absolutely. I mean, it's actually going into the science and really digging into what compounds work for what indications is going to be a very long-term process. But there are other ways where cannabis supposedly really helps patients, especially like you mentioned, the cancer patient. The godfather of my daughter, a really good friend of our family, is dealing with cancer right now. And so he has been using this product for years because he's gone through chemo
Mm.
3 times before. It's come
Gosh.
back. And anyway, so he is using cannabis in edible form all throughout his chemo just to help him get through it and to improve his quality of life, allow him to eat more. And so I guess there's the one side of cannabis where you're really targeting what can cannabis do to a certain disease. But then there's kind of these secondary quality of life components that are really kind of what the market is built on right now, right? And so how do we get from where we are now to where you're speaking about? And kind of a second part of that is like, why aren't many people doing it?
Mm. Boom. Great question.
Yeah.
So fundamentally, going back to my little hand model here that I've got for cannabis and the endocannabinoid system. I guess depending on the type of company we're talking about, they all play a bit of a role in the extraction of the key therapeutic compounds from the cannabis plant and then the alignment of those compounds with the important piece of physiology in specific diseases. So that process then, and I guess that's what's really the basis of the supply chain for modern pharmaceuticals, then opens up a whole bunch of challenges as well. So succinctly, let's say we just focus on CBD inside cannabis. You've got to find a process that's repeatable, standardizable, and kind of compliant that extracts that one compound from your cannabis plant, turns that into a pharmaceutical ingredient or an active pharmaceutical ingredient called an API. That API has to be something that's standardizable, stable, and also non-toxic, because obviously you can get elements from cannabis that end up in the end products that you maybe don't want. So you've got to make sure it's 99.9% pure CBD. So once you've overcome that challenge, you've then got the challenge of, okay, what disease do we target with that active pharmaceutical ingredient? And so you've got a catalog, let's say, of epilepsies, you've got a catalog of neuropathic pains, and you're trying to find which condition, which gap within the disease literature that this compound can best fill. And so that's your phase one, is finding where that compound fits in the mechanisms of disease. That's your theoretical starting point. Once you've worked out what disease you're targeting, let's say epilepsy, and let's say that CBD is targeting a compound or a specific receptor within the epileptic brain. And from there, you've got to scale up that ingredient so you can create enough of a batch of medicines, which also have to go through a bunch of different approvals, to then maybe conduct a trial. You've got to then recruit for that trial. You've got to then get funding for that trial. You've got to get the approvals and licenses to conduct that trial. To go from, yeah, okay, we've got an ingredient, okay, we've got a disease, we've tested it in mice, we've looked at rats, we've taken their brain tissue samples, broken it down and analyzed the brain tissue, and we can show that, okay, we finally reduced the theoretical model of seizures with this compound in this disease case. You then need to take that through phases of development. So, okay, we've now got our formulation of CBD API isolate. We now need to test that on a batch of 10 patients to start with, just to see, is it safe? Is it going to cause harm to anyone? Is it, let's say, potentially having effects on humans that it maybe didn't have effects on in the mice? Because obviously, with a human, you can have a discussion with them and decide, how does this feel? Do you have any complaints? Do you feel strange? Do you feel odd? With a rat, it's very much, has it died? Has it not died? Did the seizures go down? And oftentimes we induce the seizures in the mice or in the rat models, in the dog, let's say. And so repeating what we've created in the lab in a human then becomes very difficult, because we've got unique needs, we've got psychology, we've got consciousness to think about. And so going from theoretical model, it works in mice, we've treated mice with epilepsy, to then we've tried it on 10 patients. That can be incredibly costly just to even get the approvals, and the first approved ingredient turned into an approved medicine that's of a legal quality that you can give to a human in the first place, that has a medical condition. So you've got layers of stringency applied to this addition of a molecule to a human to a disease, which brings us on to the next question, the cost. So that theoretical research at the start's fairly simple. It could still cost like 50, £100,000 more, depending on how diligent you're going, how many samples you're taking, how many rats or mice you need to use. And then what makes it slightly more interesting still is that you translate that into a human. You've maybe got 10 patients in that cohort. 93% of the drugs that go into that phase 1 testing end up failing. So immediately you've got your proof of concept. You can show this CBD molecule treats the seizures in the mice. In that first phase of putting it in humans, 90% plus fail, either because of safety concerns, a lack of efficacy, the patients felt ill and they couldn't tolerate the drug dose, so they've had to come off the dose. It may be that, there's been a death, there's been a disease or something that's transpired that they didn't anticipate from the mouse studies. So immediately you've got a massive overhead cost sunk into the animal research. Phase 1, 90% of them fail. If you're lucky, you get to phase 2 and you maybe test on about 100, maybe 50 patients. You get a bit more of an idea how that works. You've got an idea then of what doses work, because obviously dosing a mouse is very different from dosing a human. Mice are maybe slightly more sensitive. And again, it depends on how you've created that disease model in the mouse, in the rat. So when we generalize research, and this is just an example before I talk a little bit more about some of the costs of clinical trials, the amount of work that needs to go in just to get a compound that's viable to give to a human is already, you're looking at hundreds of thousands, potentially millions, just to get to that first phase, get it to a human, and it still doesn't work. Maybe you go back to drawing board. Maybe you're lucky, you get through that first 10, you go to phase 2, then you're looking at something like 3 years to go from the mouse to the human, and then you're looking at maybe like another 2 to 3 years to go to phase 2. You've then got to think about, how do we recruit 100 epilepsy patients? You've then got to find a hospital that wants to do the study. You've got to find the researchers and the funding to do all of that. So immediately your barrier to entry and the appetite for companies to spend millions, potentially billions, to get through those phases of research is obviously, that's a massive limiting step for any company. And even if you get to phase 2, phase 3, the drug may still fail again, because it's either not profitable to produce, you can't produce it at a low enough price that it makes sense to treat those patients. The patients might not actually like it, or it might be a really small patient cohort or group. So the whole process can take about 10 years, 10 to 15 years to get a license from a molecule and an idea through to actually being licensed and allowed to be prescribed. Even then, when it's licensed and prescribed, it's in like a surveillance period. And so it could then get pulled at a later date, because you find that once you get past 500 patients or 1,000 patients, maybe 10,000 patients have taken the drug, 500 had an awful outcome, adverse reaction that you didn't see in the first 10 or in the first 100 or the first 1,000. And so the whole process of going from, we've got a therapeutic compound, we've got a disease where that could be useful, you're looking at another 10 years into the future before something's gone through those different hurdles, and billions potentially of dollars, hundreds of millions, tens of millions definitely. And then, yeah, it might still fail at the end of it. So you can see why, I guess, the pipeline, maybe not the pipeline, but you can see why the demand for cannabis to go through these trials and processes is so stringent and so costly, and also why a lot of companies just avoid it in the first place and go for like the specials categories or private clinics where you can just prescribe these things. Incredible barrier to entry. Those barriers exist for a reason, but then also there is a large concern that even if drugs go through those trials, even if you have enough money to be able to fund them, still those drugs may not actually be that efficacious or helpful for the patient. It still might not cure the disease. Yeah, you've got a 30% reduction in seizures in those patients, but they're still epileptic. And so billions of dollars, 10 years maybe plus of research time to still then not actually have something that you can commercialize and sell at the end and that's actually profitable. You can see why it then becomes, oh my goodness, how is this sustainable really? And so it's tough for pharmaceutical companies already that are looking at just non-cannabis compounds, but when you throw cannabis in there, you've got so many extra variables, and we don't really have a history of commercializing those products. Opiates, we've maybe had 50 plus years of development and refinement and evidence and kind of groundwork that you can fall back on, whereas we're really only just starting this for cannabinoids, and we also don't understand the endocannabinoid system. So we've got two very confusing areas of medicine and health. And so now we're on the long, slow journey of kind of piecing those together, finding the best matches for the right compound in the right disease that have the best effect for patients, but then also is something that's commercially viable as well for a pharmaceutical company. So there's a lot of concerns around pharmaceuticals being sort of stifled, medicine and research being stifled. Something like 200 billion a year gets spent on getting drugs just ready to be tested. And so there's something like 10 to 20,000 drugs in development at any one stage. And then there's about 5,000, maybe more again, that are actually able to start putting that into a pipeline of development too. So there's billions of dollars, very, very tight testing boundaries. And so makes it incredibly difficult for cannabis companies, makes it incredibly difficult for new entrants to the market. And so you can see why the big pharmaceutical companies almost have not a monopoly, but there's a huge financial hurdle that needs to be sort of overcome in order to even play the game of pharmaceutical drug development. And so there's a lot of discussion now around how can we make drug development a little bit more innovative? How can we better target and refine molecules before they go into the drug development process to reduce that kind of failure rate? And then also, is there kind of a new model that we could use for pharmaceutical testing that maybe reduces this? But the whole process, incredibly slow, incredibly tedious, painful. And if you're a patient that's got an emergent health condition like a life-threatening epilepsy, you likely haven't got 5 to 10 years to wait for a drug to maybe come to market. You just need something right now that's going to stop you having seizures, basically. And I think that's the argument that ultimately led to the law changes in the UK to enable some of those kids to be able to access the life-saving cannabinoid oils that are available that reduce their
No,
seizures. We don't know how most
that
of
makes
them
sense.
work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what really spawned the CBD market from a retail perspective as well. Back when Epidiolex came on to the scene, and the UK really exploded from a CBD product basis just in retail stores like Holland and Barrett. And that,
Yeah.
originally when we started our company, we were called Canarray, and we had a CBD part of the business and a medical cannabis part of the business. And right when we started, Novel Food came out saying that we had to do a toxicology study with rats, exactly what you're saying. We spent way more than 50,000 pounds to do this. And, the FSA still has not approved CBD after 5 years. So, and this is, I think, a little bit of what you were speaking about. It seems like there should be a better way to do this. I think um, having to go through killing rats to prove that CBD is not toxic, it just didn't seem like the right thing for anyone to do. And now it's this process that's gone on for 5 years. So in terms of, and there was loads of real world evidence to show that the stuff was safe. It's been used for thousands of years. So in your opinion, how important is real world evidence to this whole game of proving that cannabis is safe, effective, and can be used for certain indications well?
So I think what's a good starting point that maybe some of the clinics, some of the companies across Europe do to a varying degree well is tracking patient outcomes. That at least provides like a baseline layer of not quite clinical trial level data, but real world data that indicates, okay, we've got a set of patients, 100 patients, they've got different conditions. We measure them before they take our intervention and we measure them after, and we track their health on an ongoing basis. That's great soft data. But what that wouldn't then be able to sort of strengthen is a specific product for licensing. And so you could quite reliably say, here's our medical cannabis intervention, pre-treatment, post-treatment, and ongoing. And there are different studies in different conditions that track this to a varying degree as to how effective that's been in managing the symptoms, quality of life. But you are limited in the medical claims you can make around that. So if we were to compare that to a clinical trial, patients wouldn't know what medicine they're getting typically. They would just receive either two blank products, a placebo, or the actual drug intervention. And that kind of eliminates one layer of bias from the study, because oftentimes what you find is, depending on the treatment, the mentality and the beliefs of the patient often quite heavily influence the data and the feedback that those patients give. And particularly in cannabis, there's a big question around the bias of the studies that are being conducted at the moment. And I'm not sure if this quite answers your question, Josh, but it brought up something that I thought was quite important. What's also a massive factor is where the funding for that research has come from. Are they aligned with the company? Is it my company that's doing the research on this condition? And as well, to what degree do the researchers know who's getting what treatment, and how much could they influence the data if they wanted to? And so if we factor in that rather lengthy pharmaceutical process, there's a lot of points within that development process where bias could be identified. Bias is trying to be reduced. They'll blind it so that the researcher doesn't know which drug the patient's receiving. They're just receiving two clear oils, clear liquids in a spray, perhaps, that one's a cannabinoid drug, one's a placebo, but we don't know which one. There's all of these layers of bias that then go into the data. And so with real world data, there's none of that blinding or kind of bias removal. It's usually a clinic that maybe sells the cannabis to the patient, and it's in their interest and in the doctor's interest to report an improvement, whether they do that intentionally or not, or Whether they would admit to that or not, it depends very, very broadly. And so, as well, you've got patients. They often want to see. They've got a perspective about cannabis, whether it's whether it's positive, or negative, or they believe in the industry or they believe in cannabis, and so that plays a massive role in then the experience of the patient, but then also the results that are then gathered. So I understand the scrutiny and the skepticism then of real world data that gets gathered, but as well, there is a lot of good information you can gather because you can say, well, of those 100 patients, none of them died from cannabis overdose, toxicity, none of them got schizophrenia, none of them reported adverse health reactions, etc. And so there's a degree of screening you can do, but then the important thing about data is like what you can then actually state reliably based on that data. And so I think a problem that our industry is particularly guilty of is overgeneralizing that data. So say, oh, we've got 100 patients that use medical cannabis for their arthritis, 70% reported a improvement in the condition. If you compare that to a clinical trial, you'll find the results are way different in the clinical trial compared to that real world data measuring. And a lot of the time that's because of the blinding, it's because of the different formulations that are used, far more stringent dosing strategies. A lot of the real world data, you have a rough idea of what patients are using, when they're using it, what's in the product, but it just lacks the precision and the verifiability, the kind of protection of the data as well from personal influence. Because if I'm doing a rat study, I've killed 100 rats, a normal human would quite like there to be a positive outcome from that and say, oh, we reduced seizures in these rats by 50% and we reduced the damage to the brain tissue. A third party might look at that and go, well, you would say that because you've killed 100 mice, you've tested it with your products from your formulary or from your pharmaceutical company that sponsored the research. How do we know that it's not influenced in any way? And what we see is when the medical literature is reviewed. So, for example, we were doing we do a kind of monthly reviews in different topics for different companies. We did one on cancer. And so we were looking at, okay, there's great anti-cancer properties that they're recording in the petri dishes, in the lab, in rats and mice. But when it got translated to humans, most of the time, the studies aren't looking at the anti-cancer effects as such. They can't measure the tumor within that patient per se. If we've got a rat, we can take that out, chop it to pieces, and analyze what's in there. With a human, we can't quite do that. And so you've got to measure different endpoints in the humans that somewhat correlate to what you were looking at in the mice. And so with the cancer trials, when we did the big sort of analysis, they found a lot of the data was kind of slightly biased. They've got a risk of bias assessment that they do. A lot of them are in high risk of bias because of maybe the different affiliations with companies or the funding of the research. And the majority of the findings that have translated from the really promising mouse research into human trials has been very, very conservative in that it can reduce nausea induced with chemotherapy by like 20%, 30%. And so by the time you go from that, kind of theoretical research in mice and animals and cell samples in a petri dish, the actual what's ethical to test in humans and what's realistically we're able to measure in humans is also quite different. And so what we found was when we got to the literature reviews and what all the academia was saying, the only generalizations you could make around cannabinoids in cancer patients was primarily appetite stimulation. Some actually got a bit more nausea from some of the cannabinoid interventions. There were improvements in quality of life, and it did help with, say, kind of chemotherapy-induced pain as well. So we've gone from being able to say, oh, it's treating tumors in animals, to then actually it's maybe helps with a couple of these different symptoms or a couple of these different adverse reactions that you get from chemotherapy. So the translation from that preclinical side into humans is always a massive hurdle that a lot of companies fall down. And real world data gives you a bit of an indication, but it can't tell you what's really going on at a cellular level, where those compounds are targeting. We've got an idea of what buttons it's pushing, but when it gets to humans, it becomes a lot more complex. You've got a lot more of a kind of, well, a far more stringent ethical boundary that you can explore. And so this is what we want over here, more precise clinical data. But in reality, if we can gather real world data just to show the efficacy, the safety for now, we've already got patients using medical cannabis around the world. We should really be gathering data on that, whether it's for clinical utility or not. It's a great bit of storytelling, really, a good indicator, but it doesn't give us a lot that we can generalize out unless you've got 100,000 patients, tens of thousands of patients. There's not a whole lot of claims that you can make about that. It's very then difficult to say, oh, well, this drug, we gave patients medical cannabis. What does that mean? What compounds, what profiles, what was the exact like maybe formulation, or what were the exact constituents of that cannabis sample that was being given to the patients? How were they consuming it? How often, how regularly? And all of those variations are ironed out in a clinical trial, whereas in the observational studies, patients go home, they do what they want, they report the data. It's not as stringent or as strict, but there's definitely, if we're doing these almost like we're doing a bit of a living experiment at the moment with the cannabis industry. So if we can capture as much of that information as possible, it does give us more context. It gives us more information just to sort of like use for navigational purposes as opposed to making medical claims, if that makes sense. It's more strategic data as opposed to medical medical data for the application or utility in a clinical setting. It's not much use to a doctor in a clinic who's got to work out, oh, well, we've got a THC formula, we've got a CBD formula. How's that going to affect our cancer patient? We don't really know yet. So the translation across those stages is difficult. Real world data is a good, it provides something. It gives us some baseline as opposed to we didn't measure anything. But it's very much the foundation, stepping stone towards trying to turn that into a specific medicine that treats a specific condition reliably. So I guess that's kind of a long-winded way to get around to it being useful, but
yeah, I mean, two challenges on that. So, I mean, clinical trials also have their biases, right? Because if it's run by a company, I think, as you mentioned, there's always going to be a push from that company to make this a positive trial. So I don't know what the percentage is or the influence, but there's always going to be that bias. I understand that it's better than real world evidence, but what always confuses me is that, given what you said about your literature review with cancer and how quality of life, appetite is improved, these being such important parts of getting through a chemo trial or getting through a course of chemotherapy. I don't understand why oncologists aren't a little bit more open to giving out cannabis during chemotherapy. Do you have any understanding why that is?
So I think what most people don't realize is you've got your patient, they've got cancer. That cancer's in different stages of development, and at each stage of development, kind of new mutations occur. It connects to the blood supply. It goes from being a little benign lump into a thing that's connected to your blood. And as that cancer's evolving into a more mutant piece of human, it's adapting, it's evolving, and so that presents some more challenges and nuance as well. Because obviously, and I say obviously, sometimes you've got an early stage cancer that's quite easy to treat because it hasn't become almost smart enough to avoid or mutated enough to avoid certain treatments. And as that cancer progresses, then it gets new capabilities. It's almost like a mutant organism living in you, but made from your own cells. It can avoid your immune system. Then it can start, let's say, almost becoming like an independent little cancerous organism of its own. So there'll be a standard set of pharmaceutical treatments for each of those stages of cancer. And what we don't know really is how cannabis affects the effect of chemotherapy as it goes through those stages of cancer. We've got a fairly good idea. We've been using chemotherapy for like 30, 40 years, maybe more. We've got a fairly good idea of how those drugs, as toxic as they are, affect the stages of different cancers. What we don't know then is, the variable of cannabis, how that affects the chemotherapy and the function of the chemotherapy, but then also how it affects the tumor. And so sometimes, depending on the mutations that have taken place in the tumor, cannabinoids could actually maybe accelerate the tumor's growth or support the tumor's growth. Or, because again, this is like a mutant endocannabinoid system then that's completely non-functional or maybe functioning in reverse as it's evolved and as it's mutated. So sometimes stuff's going back to front. And so the challenge for a chemotherapy managing doctor is, if I'd say for my patient to take cannabis, what form of cannabis? Is it just one compound? Is it all these compounds? Maybe some of them are anti-cancerous. Maybe some of them promote cancer growth. But then, is that cancerous?
Is there any evidence for actual promoting cancerous growth from cannabis?
From memory, I've seen studies where one of the warnings have been that it can support, or maybe not support. And again, it's maybe not the cannabinoids, but it's the tumor itself and the kind of back to front faulty mechanisms that are occurring in those cancerous cells. So although you've got a compound that's anti-cancer, maybe, again, THC's got, that's probably the best one that everyone knows that's maybe got anti-cancer properties. What could work great for one patient, it kills their tumor and reduces the size, makes it kind of shrink. Happens to one patient, but in the next patient, you give it to them and their tumor accelerates and they die earlier. And this is quite a general trend. And realistically, we'd have to pull up one study specifically to sort of discuss this through. But we've seen, depending on, again, this is the only reason we can even explore any of this is because it's preclinical research. We couldn't test this in humans, and a lot of this is in mice and rats too. But what they found is that it can nudge the direction or nudge the needle in positive and negative directions. In a same or in a similar sense, there's lots of studies where they've shown that patients with pain, for example, if they use a low dose THC, it can reduce the pain sensation or perception of pain. But if you give them a large dose of THC, it can actually amplify the experience of the pain. And so those cellular communications can work both ways. And without zooming in on a cell in the neuron, the cannabinoids affect the response. So I send you a message, Josh. I'm hungry. You'll send back a response. Okay, Chris, here's some food. I'm now satisfied. What happens in diseases is I keep sending you a message, I'm hungry, Josh, but I don't get a response back. You're the endocannabinoid system in this sense. I'm the cancer cell. And it just keeps going, I'm hungry, Josh, I'm hungry, Josh, I'm hungry, Josh, and it gets no response. That kind of lack of feedback is, again, one of like the disease mechanisms that we've got to manage. It's a retrograde signaling process. So going back to epilepsy, stimulation, I'm sending you stimulation signals. You'll send me one back that calms that stimulation. But if I'm just sending you in epilepsy, the signals are just stimulation, 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 and there's no feedback that soothes that. And it's the endocannabinoid system in epilepsy that's sending that soothing response that regains the homeostasis, and it's a nice bit of equal messaging. Cancers and different conditions, that communication feedback can flip around. It can then become a case of you're sending me too much food, and now I'm almost suppressed or saturated and non-functional again, but on the kind of like downgraded side. So yeah, with cannabinoids, it can be a bit of a flip conversation. And if you're putting too much signal in there, the body will kind of adjust to then rebalance some of that. And so you get the reverse effect. I don't know if that makes sense. It's all quite abstract with my hands, but
yeah, there's a lot going on,
it
obviously, that
adapts.
needs to be tested for sure. But it just, anyways, moving on from that, because we could go on for
I could go
hours
down
on
the
that.
rabbit hole. I'm going to pull out some presentation slides there for a minute, Josh.
Go way down. Okay, I wanted to move over to some products. In terms of, like, I don't even know if you can comment on this, but from a premium, that word premium, what does that even mean in terms of medical cannabis from a scientific perspective?
Initial instinct is it doesn't really mean too much. And it depends again who's saying premium as well. I think with cannabis, particularly, a lot of the language comes from the cultivators. And obviously that translates over to then what the doctors and the rest of the supply chain are talking about. And with cannabis, obviously you could grow it in the garden in a dirty field. You don't know what's in the soil, and it can then aggregate and absorb and grow to contain lots of toxic chemicals and elements. A higher quality premium product, as colloquially used in the cannabis industry, would be something that's more readily tested, more stringent, and more clinically grown. So, and I say clinically grown, it's probably the wrong language, but with more oversight. So they know exactly what's in the soil. They know exactly how much nutrients and what nutrients it's receiving. They know where those nutrients are from. They know there's no molds. The air in the room is filtered, it's clean. There's no molds getting blown in by the ventilator, by the fans. Every part of the plant has an equal amount of sunlight. So I'd say it really relates to what's gone into the cultivation process, but that doesn't translate necessarily to the health outcome. So the premium side, I guess, it's kind of almost sales language in a way, but there are certainly different qualities of production. There's certainly more stringent organizations that cultivate to a higher degree. Obviously, you've got that kind of GMP grade, which is seen as the creme de la creme of cannabis production. So it's gone through all the pharmaceutical good practices and processes. But that's not to say someone couldn't recreate that at home and have an equally quote unquote premium product. So the premium would refer more to the cultivation efforts and diligence that's gone into the production of the cannabis plant. But then the actual application of that cannabis plant may or may not be more efficacious. It might be more useful, might be less useful. It's hard to say.
Got it.
But yeah, it probably refers, it's more clearly, it's got lower likelihood of having contaminants in it. It's got a bit more oversight, and it's gone through certain processes to make sure it's not moldy, contaminated. It doesn't have heavy metals in there. There's no pesticides. And so I maybe wouldn't call it premium, but there's certainly different categories of cannabis and the care and diligence and attention that's gone into it. And
so it's really the cultivation and processing, not necessarily the end product and how efficacious that is on different indications. But
yeah,
so When you're talking about, strain names and, indica sativa and just the way that people actually describe cannabis flowers at the moment, what are your thoughts there in terms of, from a medical standpoint, where do those terms sit?
There's a bit of a mixed conversation then, depending on who you speak to. If you speak to a botanist or someone that's maybe more interested in the genealogy of cannabis and where it's grown, there are very different strains and origins of where they've first been found, say India, or whether it's been different parts of Russia. I think they found a ruderalis strain out in Russia. Um, there are very specific genetic lineages, but in the current modern medical market interaction of cannabis plants, most of the breeding has made that kind of taxonomic description of sativa and indica more or less redundant now. It's useful for knowing historically and tracking the lineages of cannabis plants back to, what parts of East Asia they've been produced in, or um, other regions of the world. But it doesn't necessarily correlate to the actual health outcomes or patient impact that comes as a result of the cannabis. So, what's maybe a more practical categorization process at the moment is chemotyping, and very specifically the chemical profiles of plants, as opposed to it's a sativa, it's an indica. And I still see a lot of doctors actually using the sativa indica discussions. And realistically, medically, scientifically, it's not an accurate way to discuss cannabis and medical cannabis. And a lot of the literature, and there's a lot of nice kind of studies where they've broken this down and chemotyped a lot of these indica sativa plants. They're all cannabis sativa L at this point, and the chemical constituents and the chemical fingerprints of those plants would be a better and more accurate way to start categorizing them. And I think one big problem we see with the doctors is they're not, and this is particularly new doctors coming to the medical cannabis sector, the naming very much has like a legacy marketing background to it, and reconciling that here in the UK with, I've got a patient with cancer, I'm prescribing them a strain that's come from maybe Canada and it's got this ridiculous name. I can understand the hesitancy of medical professionals to then prescribe something that's called AK-47 or Gorilla Glue or Super Silver Haze or something. And I think that's a good indication of where the sort of barrier between recreational cannabis, the cannabis movement, legalization, kind of differs from the medical science pharmaceutical realm, which doctors are aware of. And we've got this strange meeting of recreational cannabis with medical requirements. And a lot of the doctors have stuck with that sativa indica kind of branding and language that's come over. But very little of it actually correlates to the actual effects of patients. And we often hear that maybe sativa is more uplifting, indica is more calming or soothing. That completely depends on the individual. You can give 100 patients the same sativa, everyone has a completely different reaction to it. And I say everyone, 50% will be amplified by it and stimulated by it, and 50% will probably go straight to sleep and want to take a nap afterwards. And it's very much down to the individual's endocannabinoid system, their genetic makeup, and how their cellular signaling, all their billions of cells communicate, and how they're kind of wired. And I see so many doctors kind of tying themselves around in knots, talking about indica and sativa, and oh well, this one's more of an indica, and maybe that'll give them more of a buzz, but they're getting this effect. It's very much a kind of like legacy piece of language from that North American marketing almost, and people wanted to brand their cannabis as something different. And so they say, oh, we've combined it with this and we've combined it with that. And it's this new magical strain. It's still got the same 1,500 chemical constituents, but just in a different concentration at different levels. And so ultimately, science is showing that it's a bit of an outdated way of categorizing everything now. You can take an indica from one company and a sativa from one company. It's pretty much going to have the same chemical profile, probably have the same effects in a patient. Again, depends on the patient. And it's just a bit of an outdated way of trying to communicate the effects of cannabis. But once upon a time, it was all we had. And that's obviously still quite a big part of the vocabulary for the cannabis industry. But scientifically speaking, it's slightly outdated now and inaccurate, and the
Yeah, when
crossbreeding.
it comes to flowers, there's kind of no way around it. And we've tried. I mean, we've tried to think about ways to make it more scientific, and it just doesn't work out. And then the patients don't understand where we're coming from. So at the moment, it's very much patient led, this whole industry, and patients are kind of dictating, which is a strange thing for doctors to get their head around, because patients often know significantly more than the doc does. But moving on just to cannabis 2.0 products, because then we can take the strain name out and we can just kind of think about more formulated products. What do you think will come to the UK at some point over the next 2 to 5 years regarding cannabis 2.0?
There's definitely a need for products that are using the compounds in medical cannabis, but delivered in a slightly different way. And an example for why, if you've got a patient that has bad breathing, a poor capacity for inhaling cannabinoids, let's say, or like, for example, some grandmas can't inhale things. They just cough instantly if they have to inhale anything, even if it's an inhaler, even if it's a vape, like a non-normal kind of like asthma inhaler. Some patients just cannot inhale things, and that's probably a natural. The lungs aren't designed to inhale things intentionally. As well as that, there's obviously a big stigma around the smell if you're vaping and inhaling or smoking. And then also, it's not something that most patients in the UK, for example, are comfortable doing. Most patients have never had to get a grinder, grind up weed, put it in a vaporizer, put it at a temperature, and then inhale their like a medicine from a doctor before. So the utility of turning those cannabis compounds into like those 2.0 products is that it eliminates a lot of those early challenges, stigmas. Creams, for example, topicals are a great way of kind of getting cannabinoids into the body. One difficulty, though, and sort of nuance to the vaporization versus sort of 2.0 products is vaporization is great as a way of absorbing cannabinoids. Roughly 80 to 90% of the cannabinoids that you inhale through a vaporizer make it into the bloodstream. And it's pretty quick onset as well. If you compare that to, let's say, anything that's consumed orally, you've got a bit of a delay in terms of feeling the effect, and it's got to go through your stomach, it's got to go through your gut, get absorbed into your blood, maybe activated in the liver, and then you start feeling the effect. So there is a bit of a delay with the 2.0 products. There's some challenges with the 2.0 products in the sense of if you're converting them into gummies, and I hear a lot about gummies at the moment. Challenges are it sort of looks like sweets and semi appeals to kids, which is, and this isn't my perspective, but from a kind of stigma perspective, people don't want cannabis things appealing to kids. There's already been issues where kids have accidentally taken gummies that their parents have bought or something that look like just Haribo sweets or something. But again, it does open up a new way of people accessing cannabis who maybe can't inhale as well. So people might like a vaporizer that's more handheld, where they don't have to do all the grinding and don't have to hold cannabis, don't want all the challenges that come with carrying cannabis on your person if you're a patient. But also, inhaling has its challenges in that that's a systemic effect. So if you're taking medical cannabis for your knee arthritis, the cannabinoids are going to be all the way throughout your body, and you'll probably get them in your brain and feel a bit high potentially, get a bit of a buzz from it. But again, that's kind of where we're up to with cannabis medicine. Whereas if you've got a nice topical cream for your arthritis of the knee, you don't have to do the inhaling, you don't have to make the smells, you don't have to get the hair tie, and you can put that straight on your knee and it'll absorb through your skin. Maybe not as quickly, maybe not as effectively, maybe not as quickly, but it can be just as effective and sometimes more effective without all of the adverse effects as well. So it's really about sort of managing the best delivery method for the patient whilst also factoring in the adverse effects and some of the adverse realities of cannabis as a medicine. And again, there is obviously the caveat of, well, maybe people double dose because they don't get the effect right away and then they end up overdosing. But ultimately, I think it needs to mature somewhat. And I think it's part of the process of maybe not destigmatizing, but evolving in a way that the public understands how those cannabinoids and those products are to be used. Most people are pretty comfortable with a capsule or a oral treatment. Most people are pretty comfortable with a cream. We have Voltarol, for example, for like back pain and joint pain. And so I think what we need to do now is, work out how we can take the best of cannabis and then put it in interesting delivery systems. And the bioavailability and the absorption of cannabinoids is always a tough one. They don't absorb very well, and if they do, they store in the body for a long time. So cannabis just builds up in the fat a lot of times, and we've seen that as you lose weight, perhaps the THC and other cannabinoids that stored in your fat can then be released and metabolized. So that's why cannabis can stay in your system for so long. It's kind of in your fat and tissues stored up almost. And so hard to absorb usually. That's why people use vaporizers a lot more at the moment. But those vaporizers are hard for the average patient that doesn't know anything about vaping or cannabis as well. And so I think the 2.0 products will open up more of a market for cannabis naive patients, grandmas, granddads, mums, dads, aunties, uncles. And then the bioavailability is a big thing. So is there a way that we can, as an example, I think oral CBD tinctures and oils, maximum bioavailability is around 13%. So if you're taking an oral oil, only about 13% of what you're consuming actually gets into your blood supply to then have an effect, and the rest of it just passes through your body because your body can't absorb it in any way. You can improve it with if you're consuming it with food and some other fats, but key challenge for medicine and turning cannabinoids into medical products is how do we get it into the body in a nice, efficient way so that it just targets the specific part of the body that we want to target, and how can we do so in a way that is sustainable, manageable, it doesn't just spike and then leave the body. And so what they're looking at is, can we encapsulate cannabinoids in kind of like nano emulsifiers and little kind of meshes or helpful molecules that can help the cannabinoids get into the bloodstream. So we can overcome that kind of like 13% bioavailability challenge. That's not the most. If you took anything, if you put a gallon of petrol into your car and only 13% of that petrol got used by the car, it'd be like, well, why am I doing this? What a waste. That's one of the main challenges of cannabinoid medicines. And I think these 2.0 products will open up a new kind of avenue for aiding some of those challenges of getting the cannabinoids into the body, targeting the right tissues, but then also balancing that with not making it too recreational and just having like nice, colorful candies that maybe appeal to kids, taste nice, but again, sort of moves away from that process of trying to make medical cannabis more medical and move away from maybe some of the recreational side. Like if you were to then do brownies, it's the total opposite of what would be a good delivery mechanism for cannabis as medicine. So I know there's people looking at inhalers, different nano formulations for increasing the oral bioavailability, so it goes straight into the body as opposed to just passing through the body. And so, yeah, there's some wonderful medical technologies and medical devices, and if we can introduce cannabinoids into those medical delivery systems that we've already got, I think that's where the real medical kind of utility will see an uptick. And that's something as well that's more appealing to doctors. Everyone knows how an inhaler works, or doctors are pretty comfortable prescribing a capsule or a tablet. So are patients. They're pretty used to using those medical tools and devices and delivery systems. So useful, but then also only if we get it right. If we start making brownies and space cakes for to fill that kind of 2.0 gap, then yeah, that will probably create its own issues. But patches, all these other delivery mechanisms, I think are great additions and reliable, more sustainable, far more precise. And yeah, I'm quite excited to see some of those come to fruition. And I think it'll help a lot of patients in the UK if we can get them formulated right. And again, by taking the best of the cannabis plant and using the best of what we know about the body to create more precisely aligned medical products. But yeah, I think it'll be interesting,
Great.
Josh. I don't know if you've got any on the horizon with Wellford, but I think it's some cool.
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to bring all of those in, as many as we can. Save brownies. We're never going to go down the brownie route, but I mean, one that I would really love to see is a tablet or a pill that dissolves very quickly and is nano formulated so that you really get a standardized experience, and it's quick, fast acting. So it's like a very quick onset, just like the inhalation of cannabis. I think that would be a huge step for patients to be able to know, oh, I can take this pill and it's going to affect me within 5 to 10 minutes, not half hour to an hour, which is typical, I think, for oral cannabis.
Yeah.
So we'll see. I think the UK is quite a good market. If it's one of the best markets in Europe in terms of allowing these types of products. So we'll see what the future brings in the next kind of 6 to 12 months for us. But last question, just around building a long-term platform and how companies can really create a competitive moat or really gap when it comes to really taking science into a serious consideration with cannabis. What do you think? What do you suggest, and what do you guys talk about in your consultancy?
So I'm going to use a couple of analogies. I think maybe the way the cannabis industry maybe falsely interprets a lot of science and research and how the medical processes and research processes work is oftentimes the founders, directors, investors of a company, they have a pre-formulated idea of what they want to create, which is great, but it hasn't necessarily been crash tested or validated or reviewed. And what we see that ends up happening, and an analogy we use for sort of depicting that is kind of like in Formula One. And I guess there's a few good movies as well I could think of, but Formula One, they've got genius engineers perfectly crafting the shape of the Formula One car. So it is the most silky machine moving through the atmosphere. It's got the most grip. It's the most powerful. The head of McLaren, Ferrari, and F1 doesn't just go, I want a big spoiler on the back. I want a nice big vent on the front. And then I want the biggest coolest tires on the Formula One car. What he does instead is go, right, guys, you're the experts. Go and make the most refined, ultimate driving machine you possibly can that wins me races. They're not there telling their unbelievable engineers, make it loud, put a big spoiler on it, make it red, make it go faster. And I think that's kind of the approach that a lot of cannabis companies take at the moment, is they're telling the scientists what they want. The scientists already have a great view of what works, what doesn't, where the opportunities are. And if you can harmonize the driving force of a founder and CEO and board around the knowledge and expertise of a scientist, the scientist can become your Lewis Hamilton super engineer for your Formula One team. But I think ultimately the process by which we start developing ideas into products is slightly back to front at the moment. They'll create the interesting shaped new F1 car with the nice big spoiler and all these vents and things like that, and then go and ask their scientists to validate that, rather than using the scientific process to create and engineer the best possible drug, the best possible car. And that kind of development process is what's missing from cannabis companies and the cannabis industry at the moment. We'll speak to a CEO who has no idea why they've chosen that product, why they've chosen that strain. They've got a good deal from someone in Canada or Australia, or they've got a partner, or we own a facility in Spain. And that's why they've made those decisions, as opposed to, before we spend any of our money, before we invest it in products, medicines, let's make sure we've got the right scientific foundations and we've got the science of the plant and the science of the human lined up to give our product and our intervention and our medical mission the best possible chance of success and winning that race. And most companies just have kind of got that R&D development process back to front. And if you can start with the scientific methodology and apply that to medical cannabis businesses and pharmaceutical companies, you're winning. And I think GW's done the best in terms of using what science was available, validating that with experts, using that to create a very specific formulation for a very specific use case in a very specific condition. And then they've got the money to be able to scale that and put it through those processes. And I think a lot of companies they make the product first and then try and validate it, as opposed to using all of the information that's out there, the 40,000 plus cannabinoid studies, the experts that have done this for years. They'll just go and tell them to put a big spoiler on it and then make it red and give it a good name. And there's a lot more to the medical cannabis industry and the development of cannabinoid medicines and technologies that those people will miss out on just because they haven't approached it scientifically. You're in a realm of medical science and technology that requires you to play by the rules and play the game in a certain way. And a lot of companies, CBD companies, cannabis companies, cultivators, don't really understand the game that they're playing and the kind of realms and the almost like the battlefield that they're on. They've got a preconceived idea. This is what we're going for. Haven't validated it, but I've got the money. Let's go do it and see if it works. There's so many genius scientists around the world that could, if you gave them that kind of money, they could bloody cure cancer probably, but it ends up getting wasted on kind of like dead products. And so that's why big pharmaceutical companies spend so much on the scientific R&D before you actually start applying it, doing clinical trials, the pipeline, the databases, the validation. That's what ahead of time, if done properly, saves billions and years of wasted effort. And I think the same goes for the cannabis industry at the moment. The strategies for choosing products for clinics are very wishy-washy. It's just what's cheap, what's a good deal. A lot of the doctors don't really know what they're prescribing anyway. So there's no science behind the product selection process. There's then no science for the doctors to be able to make a mind up as to how they're going to prescribe this for a certain patient. What are the use cases? What should I look out for? Is this even going to work in the first place? And then the patients are just on the receiving end, just kind of getting given whatever the CEOs kind of pass down to the doctors to be able to work with. And realistically, you want to get your teams the best tools, the best science, and then all of that trickles down into the best service for patients and the best outcomes for patients. And it makes the doctors' lives easier, makes the companies' lives easier, way more efficient, way more effective. And I think that's the next differentiating factor that is going to start separating the medical cannabis clinics and companies from, the kind of losers from the winners, but also it's a battle of efficiency and money and fundraising too. So that's also a factor around the science. And so lining all that up into a nice profitable endeavor that also does great things for patients is being made a lot harder than I think it needs to be as well. But also it's a challenging environment. Anyone can set up a cannabis company. Doctors don't really know what they're prescribing. Products come from all over the world. And so now the next phase of the industry is really kind of tailoring all of that in, locking it down to, and aligning it with the science and the facts and the evidence. And then the rest of it's all kind of easy from there. But unless you've got those foundations in place, you have to reverse engineer everything. And we've spoken with all sorts of companies that have boomed, busted, raised 10 million, lost 10 million. None of them looked at anything scientific before they started. It was all about brand. It was all about, we've got the best sativa strain. It's got nothing to do with any of that. If you don't understand this industry at a biomolecular level, basically you are kind of blind and at the whims of the industry, really. So I guess those would be my concluding points, perhaps, for you, Josh. But also, there's been some incredible results that patients have got simply just from crude cannabis use. And I speak to lots of patients who've had an incredible transformation in their cancer, and they're cancer-free now. But I can't verify that in a lab. And I remember when I was already amazed by what I was reading in the medical literature, but when you actually go and speak to patients, I hear some incredible stories. But lining that up with what we can measure, what we can verify, and what's true, that's also another game in itself as well. So as a North Star, I think science is where the cannabis industry in the UK especially needs to get to. If what other countries around the world are doing this very well and they've got great scientists behind them, the UK, we've not really got any science going on. It's very hard for researchers, very hard for universities to get any approval. It's very hard to find supplies for clinical trials. And so I think all of the growth of the cannabis industry now comes from using all this science that's there, that's available, but in a useful, impactful, and efficient way, rather than we just need to raise 10 billion for a clinical trial. It's like you've got to do way more than that. There's alignments, there's easy wins, there's lots of kind of breadcrumbs and hidden treasure locked in the research already that if you line up with it in your organization, it's incredibly impactful and way more efficient. You get that great data, you get that great IP and the great outcomes for patients as well. So I think it's a bit of orientation for companies to do. Obviously, the government struggles to make sense of what's going on with the cannabis industry as well. I don't blame them. And then, big barriers to entry for medical cannabis to be taken to the level where the pharmaceuticals industry is at the moment. Different levels of funding, different levels of stringency and development that go into their medicines. And because they're playing around with billions, they've got to be way more calculated. Pharmaceutical companies only going to fail once and make that billion pound mistake once. Once that's happened, next time they're going to be way more stringent. And I think a lot of the cannabis companies in the UK are going to have to learn the hard way, spend all their money, and kind of have to go trial and error it until they get we just sat down with some scientists and worked out what was the best, easiest course of development. Then could have been a lot less stressful, a lot more efficient, and impactful. And ultimately, for us as researchers, we've done all this research for years. We want to make sure it's used and applied in the industry and benefited from. So that's the purpose of why we're here as a company. We're here to make sure all this gets used. Obviously, I'm going to say science, 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 but there's a lot of use cases demonstrations, data to back it up, and everyone likes to say we need more science, we need more education. It's all here. Come use it. And thank you, Josh, for letting me come and talk about endocannabinoids, ECSs, drug development, and complain a little bit about the cannabis industry. But
thank you for being on, Chris. It was great to have you.
Thank you for listening to the Wellford podcast. Follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen.